A couple of things about cinema before we get started. Primarily, I'm going to be talking to you about the art realm and about photography. But we never, in the shaping of this course, wanted to ignore cinema, because it really, in the 100 years of the 20th century, became the predominant art form. So what we elected to do is simply give you a few things in passing about it. To do that, give you some certain points depending on the decades we're talking about in it, and then a few representative examples. I realize that in something that has a certain popularity, and a very much a general public popularity, that everybody seems to, maybe you don't go through life having a favorite painting or a favorite photograph, but you probably have a favorite movie and things like that. What I want to do in picking a few out is simply to show you some examples of why they're important, or what sort of trends they point out, or what sort of facts they make about the movement at the time. Not necessarily that they're all my favorites, or all your favorites, or all Dan's favorites. In fact, when we get to the 60s and 70s, there's a couple he liked which I can never understand. But anyway, it's a varying thing, but because of its sheer popularity and its sheer presence, you can't ignore it. So just to show you a little bit about the tip of that cinematic iceberg is what I want to do at different points in the remaining lectures, just to give you that sense of that evolution as well. Because it was very important, and it either had a profound development on ideas and trends, or in fact was reacting to them at the time. So I've kind of chopped it up a bit into sections just to give you some idea of what goes there. Roughly the 1890s to the 1920s was when that first began in terms of the technology catching up with the ability to capture motion and do it. I showed you at the beginning of this course in the first lecture Edward Muybridge's horse and the 16 phases of stops at which he took it to try and all prove that all legs were off the ground, etc. Muybridge and others who followed him experimented with motion in films and experimented with ways of putting them together, sometimes with dramatic results, sometimes with very clumsy results. But it evolved by the last decade of the 19th century that it was possible to do something with this. So in those first few years of the 20th century, it was very much an experimental thing. Everybody who got involved with it was sort of busy with trying to learn the language. There wasn't one sort of stylistic innovation. There were attempts at different things, somewhat successful, somewhat not. But that fascination was there with the moving image from the beginning. It was certainly a silent era, certainly an era in which black and white predominated, of course, and others in which there were limitations of technique, and of course finding their own way with what was possible with the image there. Generally speaking, subjects were either documentary or pre-forms of entertainment and expressionism of some sort. So that in picking a few films from this era, I just want to give you some sense of that semblance of what's there. Starting with, in 1896, William Hines's The Kiss, which was a very brief one-reeler. It existed exactly of something like, I think, 47 seconds. Basically a gentleman curling back his mustache and planning one. And that's it. But the entrancement of what the movies could do and everything like that was there from the very beginning. Georges Méliès in France was a street magician, a very successful commercial magician who got fascinated by film, did elaborate sets, did what were the first sort of special effects. He would do things like close cropping, like tight editing, like elaborate mentations of what have you, even hand coloring individual cells of the film sometime to give the effect of a voyage to the moon, or later the conquest of the North Poles. In the course of that, he also would reflect from time to time on certain cultural manifestations. The trip to the North Pole, for example, he had a group of 6 actors representing sort of a early League of Nations, an early, if you will, international community. You can tell by some of the costuming in the background. He had an Oriental, he had a Russian, he had even a cowboy involved in this experimentation. And at one particular scene, to sort of satirize the suffragette movement, which was very predominant in those early years of the 20th century, He had a number of suffragettes picket his explorers and wanted to go on the trip with him as well. It also, of course, had monster special effects in it too. This is the giant of the North Pole about to eat a couple of the hapless explorers. The Great Train Robbery, some people say, is the first complete narrative film, filmed in the western wilds of New Jersey, and on elaborate sets that were part of Thomas Edison's stationary darkroom work, and also, of course, in the wilderness too. It's also famous, many film historians will tell you, for sort of breaking the screen with the cinema. At the very end, having the cowboy point his gun and fire it at the camera, for example, at you, the audience. Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. Probably the first real epic in silent films. Ran for many hours. Was basically the story of the Civil War and its aftermath. And it's that weird thing now because, of course, it is also one of the most early and significantly flaming racist films of all time. The heroes of it being, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, the blacks being cast as villains, the chief black villain being played by a white actor in blackface. You can't ignore it. It's there. It's a social convention. At the same time, the structures of the film were very dramatic and very well done. Griffith was an epic filmmaker from the start. Early on, of course, there were also protests of it by the Black Leagues against the Ku Klux Klan. You have to remember that one of the great transformations in American society occurred in the first half of the 20th century. In the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, the Ku Klux Klan was a dominant political and social force in this country, and then became very reviled very quickly. 2 years later, he did Intolerance, another multi-hour epic. This one was very fascinating because it was taking place in 4 different venues of time, all the way back from ancient Babylon to different time period to the modern day. It told 4 separate stories, and it didn't tell them sequentially. That is to say, he would hop from one period to the other to continue the narrative about. It made you work as an audience to see what was there. The only break between the eras came when he would go back to the cradle of civilization endlessly rocking to show us what was happening. It was also one of the first cast of thousands movies ever made. Elaborate sets were built in the Hollywood backlots, in this case for the Kingdom of Babylon, with casts of thousands parading and demonstrating in the work. German Expressionism, not to be ignored. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was one of the great films of that particular era. A dream film, if you will, a narrative which had a certain twist to it in its storytelling. And all the sets were very dramatic, with the actors going about the stage in the sort of settings of the dream world that was depicted in it. By the 1920s it came along, this was the final silent decade. Certain things had become established. Another important thing to always consider about film is that it's an industry. It's a commercial enterprise, it's an undertaking. And it had built up behind it, because it was a collaborative art form, a great deal of production and a great deal of money involved in it. Put money into it to try and raise money from it. Within that began to rise on both an international scale and in the United States and Hollywood, a whole studio system. We tend to think now in terms of the, I guess the old French auteur system of, the fact that the director always controls the entire look and shape of the film. And certainly when I give you the list of films, I give you the director's name for them. But in these days, in the teens, in the 20s, and the 30s, and the 40s, it was largely a production system. The person who had the say-so as to what a film ultimately looked like was not the director, was not the editor, it was usually the studio and the studio executives. And nearly all the studio executives, at least in Hollywood, were expatriates, Jews from Europe, who came about and established the industry, first in New York and then quickly into Hollywood, where the climate was much better and much easier to do. Last thing to be said is that also in the 20s there became the establishment of the business end, so that not only was the production end done by the studio, but also the distribution end. if you were a major Hollywood studio growing up in the 20s and 30s, you owned theaters across the country. Your films were made and shown in those theaters, and that's the way you gained more profit into your making of the work. That would not die out until the government ruled it illegal in 1948. So remember these certain factors when you look at the work too. Some other films in the 20s, just to show you the international work. King Vidor's Big Parade, which was notable for the fact that it reflected the recent World War I and showed us, in an attempt to show us the very realistic settings by using outdoor cinema and setups, by using real dramatic action, and by using sets which were in the mud and in the dirt as well. Yes, there was a great romantic story in it as well, but above all, that realism was what was remarked about in the cinema of the day. The other major film of that period was Sergej Einstein's Battleship Potemkin, which had to do with the early revolt of the Russian Navy in the days of the Tsar, and the Tsar's attempt to put it down. It was not so much the narrative was pretty straightforward as it was the filmmaking that was very dramatic, especially what is called the Odessa Steppe sequence, where Eisenstein invented photomontage, the way of showing not just continuous motion, but cutting quickly from different scenes and putting them together, so that you went from the overall shots of the troops marching down the steps, slaying the citizens, to actual close-ups of the people and the bodies there. That had a tremendous impact. So much so that Eisenstein became an international symbol. And 2 years after making Battleship Potemkin, the Russian government decided to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Russian Revolution by doing October, all about the October Revolution, in which he restaged Lenin's uprising against the Tsar in a number of sequences. This is a rather fascinating film. It was filmed between roughly 1926 and 1927. What was happening at that time? Well, Lenin, who was a celebrated, of course, hero of the movement, died in 1924, and the rise of Stalin was beginning. And so what became a dramatic statement for Eisenstein in the course of making this film, like he did Potemkin, also became a collaborative effort. And while Stalin was quickly reducing the number of people he was sharing power with, the censors were also working on Eisenstein to trim this scene, change that scene, work the scene a little bit, so that by the time it reached the Russian audience, it was chopped up from Eisenstein's vision. And then years later, when its distribution worldwide and in America, it got chopped up still further. One of the first corporate, if you will, productions of the early days. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, early science fiction film, which was actually more a social comment about the future, when man was run like a machine and forced to adapt to that system and to what worked there, and the ultimate revolution that was there. Incidentally, don't remember to set your clocks on Sunday too, by the way. Okay. Notable for the fact of the symbolism that was there in the machine age of the future and the rebellion and the individuality of man that led the revolt against it. Also, an interesting social comment on this, by the way, was that the stairways and the ramp leading up to the, if you will, furnace there was something that so impressed one German commander that in the concentration camps in World War II, he set up a unloading system for the Jews that was a platform leading up to one of the camps too, based on this scene. You never know what effect a film, good or bad, is going to have. Wings, again, a nice romance. Most notable perhaps for its, if you will, special effects, which consisted of the fact that they actually put the camera in the planes and staged the flying sequences in the air with the actual cameras in the biplanes. Another revisiting of the tale of World War I, in this case of the air war, but these were very elaborate staged works. A lot of it filmed out here near San Antonio in Kelly Field, by the way. Also notable because George Lucas, when designing Star Wars, filmed these battle scenes in the air as the model to inspire his people for the, of course, attack on the Death Star. Abel Gance's Napoleon, one of the earliest long epics, which contained not only, of course, a narrative story of the early years of the rise of Napoleon, but also had such innovation as collage, that is, different scenes spliced together and filmed in the work. He was also one of the earliest to attempt hand coloring his cinema film and also using it in panoramic format too, even breaking the sequence of the panorama in some instances. It's a pretty dynamic film if you ever get a chance to see it. And finally, ending this era, Al Jolson's Jazz Singer, the story of a cantor's son who wants not to follow his father into the faith, but to become a Broadway entertainer, and does so by adapting blackface and performing in the stage in New York at the time. Despite that, again, social challenges, the fact that the Jazz Singer was also the first sound film in any way. Silent in parts, but also with soundtrack in part too. And it heralded, of course, the rise of the songs in that era too. So those are the type of things that are happening early on in film. To review, of course, what we've seen in photography and art, the social realism of Russia, the Dadaists and what they were doing contemporaneously, the surrealists and the abstractionists and what they were doing too, and of course even our friend Dali and some of his work. Incidentally, for those of you who were inquiring about this picture, I found some of the contact prints of the outtakes of that sequence. You can see how it went through many rehearsals and many flights of cats and many tossed pails of water to get the final look of the film. Water in front of Dali's face, stagehand holding chair, things like that. We can't do that, so it took about 12 shots to get the final effect. Dali, of course, went on and experimented with the camera and with film for years afterwards. This is Dali Atomicus, and this is his death skull. Surrealism or symbolism? Okay. These things came together in this political conscious era of the 30s in ways that were quite dramatic. John Hartfield essentially was a photomontage artist, but they're adaptations of social realism, of Dada, of photojournalism, and even a critical perspective which he brought to his work. He came out of the Dada movement. He was influenced by Brecht. He was a communist. He supported Lenin. He was anti-British. He opposed the Nazis, and when the Nazis took over Germany, even though he was anti-British, he fled back to Britain. His work shows up in the German press of the teens and the 20s at first. They, of course, work at his raised fist, collaged against the larger fist in the studio, or his satirical work about Hitler. These were cut out from different photographs at the time, pasted together. This is a halftone reproduction. But the title was "The Nation Stands Solidly Behind Me," and of course, the stand solidly behind me as the whole nation chained and is leading them. These are the sort of anti-Nazi things that Hartfield was most famous for. He despised Hitler and what he was trying to do. This is Hitler's cathedral with the awed nation staring on at the cathedral of Nazi power, which of course are nothing more than military shells and armaments to make the cathedral. That sort of work was very important. And you can see this coalescing. It's not just the wit and humor of the Dadaists. It's not just random symbolism that you see with some of the surrealists. There is a purpose and intent of political movement about it. And Hartfield is one of those modern people who does that work and does it so critically. We've already discussed modernism. I simply wanted to put it again in your perspective because all this is taking place between the teens and the 30s. In Europe, this whole background of the rise of the modern society. In the teens, such things as Duchamp's nude descending the staircase, to probably one of the most famous pictures from the 30s, which was, of course, Picasso's Guernica. I'm not going to lecture long and loud about Guernica because I can get an art historian up here and he can keep you busy all afternoon telling you all about the symbolism in this picture. What is important to say is that it was a protest done by Picasso, who was a native Spaniard living in France at the time when he heard in 1937 that the Germans had bombed this small town in Spain and killing many citizens. Reports still vary as to how much damage was not done, how much life was lost. It's still unclear, but it made important headlines, and none more so than when Picasso painted this. He had a huge canvas in his studio, which he was originally going to do another abstract work on, but when he heard the news of Guernica, he painted this instead and put it in the Paris World Exhibition of 1937. At first it caused a little stir, but since following the Paris exhibition it went on a world tour. And during the world tour it gained great notice and great significance. We can go into symbolism of all sorts. The mother screaming, holding the dead child, the symbolism of the bull, which used to stand for Picasso but may also stand for military aggression. The dying horse. The light above at the top, which is either an eyeball or a light lamp, depending on what's there, and the light coming in from the open window at the side. All these sort of things art historians will tell you are significant in there. I've always enjoyed the fact that when Picasso was asked about the symbolism in the painting, he said, "What symbolism? That's a bull, and that's a horse, and that's a screaming woman," you know. But it is. It's not more. It's more than that, definitely. The things that were arising in America into the 20s was a strong sense of realism. Yes, we've seen realism before in the 19th century, but this was a bit different. There was no one variety of realism. It was very diverse. Some celebrated urbanization, some celebrated industrialization, some were critical of the human condition, the social conditions that existed. Schools like the Ashcan School and the 14th Street School tried to see this grim work that was there. Other photographers arose during the 30s with the WPA, the Works Project Administration, the government support of federal artist projects that were more celebratory of American culture. They built upon modernism. They built upon these other leading shifts, but they found their own language as well. These are some of the realists that you encounter in the early decades of the century. John Sloan, for example, who began with sort of a rather pictorial work like this, one of Dan's favorite images, wonder why, anyway, of a Chinese restaurant. But very quickly he found everyday life to celebrate and see. He had a studio that faced out onto the square in New York. So he would paint things like three women on the roofs on Sunday morning washing their hair. Or things like girls in the 1920s returning from, in the dawn's early light, returning from a night of partying under the L. Things like this tried to show the different structures and the different classes. He was very much class conscious. Besides the painting side, which he made a good living at, he also did covers for the masses, the great socialist communist workers magazine of the teens and the 20s. This one depicting John D. Rockefeller with blood on his hands, while the embattled laborers are breaking down the door and coming for his head. Those sort of things were typical also of Sloan's work. George Bellows was more celebratory of the everyday life in the New York streets in the early years of the century, or this very famous picture of the boxers. Edward Hopper. Hopper was more internalized in his work. His work sort of showed the fact that when you saw a building, when you saw a street, you didn't see a lot of life, but you saw little nuances for it, pictures of it here and there. His world was more internal. The people in his pictures were not necessarily having a great time, but they were going through something emotional, something internal, something intellectual. And they set up this certain pattern to comment upon society and modern culture and what the city was doing to people at the time. His most famous painting, of course, is the Nighthawks, which has been adapted by many artists ever since. It's a very dramatic, very fine composition, again with that same sort of social question mark underneath it. And other people have liked to use it for other reasons. This is one of Dan's favorite pictures, for example, too. All right, digress. Charles Sheeler was a photographer. He did these very clean, straightforward, large view camera pictures of industry. But he was also and most noted to be a painter. And he would adopt this same sort of clean, some semi-abstract, semi-documentary line to his depictions of interiors, of the city, of industry, of life in general. These sort of things that were leading up to and after World War II were significant departures from just the realist school while still remaining true to it. At the same time, the rise of photojournalism expanding, exploding almost, if you will. The illustrated press was coming along, the camera was getting smaller, we were having faster films, we had flash bulbs, we had instantaneous photography. Newsreels and motion pictures were adapting themselves to the growing cinema at the time too. And they all reflected this faster pace of modern life. You see things like electricity, you see things like the radio, you see things like the automobile celebrated more and more. The pages of the newspapers began to drop away from just type and use and feature photographs, such as the 1930 Hindenburg Explosion. Using a photograph to perhaps tell you as much or at least reach you more emotionally than just the strange, plain straight columns of type that were there. 2 days ago, we had the 75th anniversary of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. I'm sure some of you may have heard of it. In fact, that in 1938, he scared the hell out of the nation with a broadcast based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds that sounded like nothing so much as an actual documentary radio program reporting the attack of the Martians. There's still some debate of how effective that was, but there's no denying the fact that it did cause an impact, especially nationally, and made Wells not just a former New York theater producer and director, but also an international celebrity. So the next day, Halloween, 1938, he appeared before the press, repentant, chuckling all the while probably, but certainly repentant about the work, and he arranged to have his portrait made with this sort of haunted look and this underlit lighting to sort of feature his work. And this kind of picture ran in almost every newspaper by November 1st. And of course, Dan has mentioned the press's collaboration, if you will, with FDR. You don't see many pictures of FDR in his wheelchair. The fact the press just simply felt it was non-heroic to show the man. So whenever it was somehow, usually they would defer taking the picture until he was braced, as in this case on his son's arm, meeting Winston Churchill, or in other instances where it could be covered up in some sort of fashion. This was not any sort of nefarious plot on the part of the newsmen. At the time, the attitude was, it's not a gotcha sort of society back in the 30s. It was sort of a way to depict your leader in his more heroic pose. That attitude prevailed in photography, where you wanted to show the underbelly of life, where you wanted to show the fact that there was need for social change, usually claimed through the documentary photograph, where you had time to examine the whole story, where you could take days or weeks, or in some cases even months, to go out and photograph a certain social situation. And that's what happened in the 30s among the many documentary photographers in this nation and others. One of the things that made that most practical was the fact that we got rid of flash powder. We got rid of that sort of way of, well, when you fill the tray with flash powder and set it off, yes, we'd have a nice lit room, but we also have smoke coming all the way to the back of the room in about 10 seconds. So you got rid of that social inconvenience, if you will, to get the dramatic work. The Urnox, as you can tell by the look of the lens, was one of those that was able to take pictures with available light. And Eric Solomon, a society doctor in Germany, was one of the first to actually go out and take pictures at, in this case, the conference. That's Aristide Briand, the French minister. He and the other ministers were looking around saying, where is Solomon? He should be here. Ah, there he is. Click. Got him. Another chance when, of course, the old frame of the photograph is broken by the recognition of the viewer by the subject. He would also take pictures late at night at conferences and social gatherings. This is a peace conference in Geneva in the 20s, taken at about 2 a.m. when everybody was falling asleep when they should be working. And of course, following the Guernica shortly was probably the biggest revolution in the late 20s and early 30s was the Leica Camera. It was small, it took 35mm film. You didn't have to have these big press cameras anymore. It took available light. It had a bright lens, it had a sharp lens, and it could take quietly. You clicked the button, it did not go clack, it went and you could take a soft picture. You've seen the picture we showed you before, a Mussolini study. That was done with a Leica. As well as Bill Brandt's photographs of the underclasses working in Britain in the 20s and 30s and 40s. German society and culture. James van der Zee with his photographs in Harlem in the 20s and 30s. Documentary photography based from film. Robert Flaherty's documentary film of the Eskimo Nanook of the North, which also featured still work from the same sessions. And finally, the rise of the picture magazines in the 30s. This is the first issue of Life, done in 1936. The photograph is by Margaret Bourke-White. If you've noticed in the readings, one of your readings was of Bourke-White's work. She was one of the first women documentary photographers to work in the American journalistic movement. You opened a page of Life magazine, you weren't faced with columns of type. You were faced with a big picture and a little short first part, and it might be opposite an ad, because commercial advantage was something that Life was looking for in its work as well. But above all, it showed you different scenes. This is Bourke-White's photograph of the Montana relief workers. And this is the book she became famous for in her mid-30s. You have seen their faces. That she did with her husband Erskine Caldwell, playwright and author, where they traveled through, especially the South, and photographed. Flash photographs of my subject were imprisoned on a sheet of film before they knew what had happened. She used a lot of flash photography. She was not necessarily subtle, but the images she got depicting poverty in the South were dramatic, and they had a significant impact throughout the culture. One of her most famous pictures of a bread line in front of a billboard sign in 1934, reflecting all sorts of levels of racial and cultural mix that were there. Probably the biggest movement that occurred, though, that still continues to have impact today, was an outgrowth of President Roosevelt's economic plans for this country. In the Department of Agriculture, he set up the Farm Security Administration under a man named Rex Tugwell. Tugwell was part of that liberal brain trust of Roosevelt's at the time. And they set up something called the Farm Security Administration. At first it was the Resettlement Administration, then the Farm Security Administration with its Information Division, which is the important thing. And then that evolved during World War II into the Office of War Information. For that decade, roughly 35 to 45, they employed a number of photographers. They sent them out across the country. Roy Stryker was the head of the administration. He himself was not a photographer, but he advised all these other photographers, and their names became famous throughout the history of photography in the 20th century. That's a portrait of Stryker, by the way. As the news was appearing in the papers, the president and the administration wanted to show a positive face on America coming out of the Depression, that the administrative plans, that the social programs of the FDR administration were working. So the Farm Security Administration hired photographers to go around the country and show this program at work, to show America recovering. Was it propaganda? Yes. But it was also information too. The work could be seen as simply as in ads for different programs, or showing different things about working the farm, living in the city, what was happening in the 30s in America. But in the process, some of the photographers had significant eyes and took dramatic pictures to show what life was like at the time. This is Russell Lee's photograph of one particular farm family. There even were early experiments in color, too. Significantly, it showed social conditions throughout the country. Some photographers went into the cities. Some photographers stayed in the country. Some went back and forth, all to sort of show people rebuilding in the process of the face of this depression that Dan has told you about. Yeah, I love the table setup too. You did notice it, good. Here's a more traditional family meal. But this was sort of an attempt at first to show how people were facing the depression, and then as the years evolved, how they were recovering from it. So yes, there was a certain propagandist look, but there was also a certain social look to it as well. It had that impact. And what's fascinating about the archive is the fact that it still exists. It was a public archive. The work could be maintained, could be taken care of, could be shown in different ways. Some of the work more dramatic than others, and some of it much more documentary. Dorothea Lange's famous migrant mother. She stopped at a camp for Okies heading towards California. This was in California, actually, and photographed her mother with her 5 children. This was one of the outtakes from that shot. This is, of course, the famous photograph. It became probably one of the 2 or 3 most famous photographs of the 20th century. It has documentary value. Of course, it has symbolic value. It has propagandist value. And it's just a flat-out beautiful looking picture, too. And it was used throughout the 1930s and 40s to explain federal programs or to show something about what was happening culturally, economically, socially in America. The skull picture you see here was done by a different FSA photographer who found the skull in the desert, took a picture of it because he was covering the drought in North Dakota at the time, and it was a significant, tremendous drought. Liked the skull so much he moved it around and put it in another place. Unfortunately, the Republicans in Congress got hold of this and found out it's effective. Daily newspapers throughout the United States fall for this term of a phony photo, phony picture. It made the headlines. But you can't deny what's in the whole file. And it had a big impact. And it still does. These pictures continue to be republished today. So the question you have to ask yourself with any body of photographs like this, any program that encompassed 10 years or however many years it might take, is what did it do at the time, and what, if it's preserved, can it still do today? Because in the process of trying to show a government at work, it also revealed much about the whole culture and society of that time. We can show you bar graphs of the entire trauma that the country went through in the 30s with the Depression. But it's nothing compared to some of what the photographs can show you too, even today. Other things evolved from this era also. James Agee, the writer, and Walker Evans, the photographer, produced in 1941 a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. They spent 8 weeks in 1936 in rural Alabama photographing to do a photo story on 3 families. That's the book jacket to the first edition. If you find it, let me know. But the statements they made about it were, I think, significant to consider it. If I could do it, I'd do no writing at all here. This is Agee, the writer, talking. It'd be photographs. The rest would be fragments of cloth, bits of cotton, lumps of earth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors, plates of food and of excrement. He wanted to give you the feel that was there, that the photographs could give. And he felt at the end of the project that his writing was poor in comparison. Or this is from the introduction. The photographs are not illustrative. They and the text are co-equal, mutually independent, and fully collaborative. But their fewness and by the impotence of the reader's eye, this will be misunderstood by most of that minority which does not wholly ignore it. In the interest, however, of the history and future of photography, that risk seems irrelevant and this flat statement necessary. The book consisted of Walker Irvin's photographs, Agee's text, and from the beginning they felt both were co-equal, co-important. It's a hard read in places, but it may be significant for you to try someday, because it really was a strong collaboration to become a brilliant writer and a brilliant photographer. These are a couple of Evan's pictures, that of a family, this of a child's grave, or this of a storefront, that predominate in this book at the time. Another group that popped up at this time in 1936 was the Workers' Film and Photo League. As the name might apply to you, it was much more socially conscious and socially aware. It consisted largely of trade union activists, political protesters, socialists, in support of changing the world that way. They would go into local communities and photograph what was going on in the working classes. And they did it from their own standpoint to exhibit the work, to perhaps sell it to magazines when they could, but for their own social conscience as well. In the 1950s, we haven't gotten to this yet because they became subject to the House Un-American Activities Committee and got closed down by blacklisting. But the important work that they did at the time had a very significant impact. Starting, of course, with the great social reformer Louis Hine, who actually was one of the founding members, who in the 1920s and 1930s exposed child labor and made child labor laws change in this country. And so the Workers' League came from that. Again, they had a particular social consciousness, a particular political perspective. But in the process of creating a group of photographs, they also showed us many other things about culture and society at the time. This, by the way, is these are two doctors who are doing experiments with cocaine. They addicted these dogs, and then the dogs are lining up for their daily dose. Real thing. The commercial camera also consists at the time. Again, you'll find the traditional things, portraitures existing here with the worries, and also the document. Oh, oops. There you go. How you doing? Okay. It continued to be part of the social context and celebration. You went to the studio, you dressed up in your finery, you were photographed in such conditions. Photographers also went out, some commercial photographers, and photographed businesses. These are from glass plates that a traveling photographer did in Corpus Christi in the 1930s of all the businesses in Corpus. So you can see the prices of potatoes as well as the layouts and design of the people working in the stores. Experimental styles and advertising were adapted by the different movements that had come again. You might see constructivism, you might see surrealism appear in advertisements about refrigerators, or in ads about medicine. This is a studio depiction of the Black Plague. Or in fashion illustration at the time. These sort of things were typical in the pages of the journals at the time. There was also California modernism, a reaction to the pretty pictures of the pictorialists, the straightforward work, largely in reaction to people like William Mortensen, who did these sort of genre pictures that were heavily retouched, The Witch's Sabbath, human relations, other idealistic things like that. The modernists were largely a group of people who came up following along the lines of Charles Sheeler, pure, straightforward photographs of design. Edward Weston, his famous photograph of a green pepper. Or a toilet bowl with its own aesthetic power, its own aesthetic function. It depends how you photograph it, what you do with it. Ansel Adams. Imogene Cunningham woke up one morning and saw the landscape on her bed. That's a tremendous photograph. Tina Modotti and Mexican Workers. And the everyday moment that continued to be celebrated, the snapshot, the daily instantaneous work that was That was there. The message of the street. Straightforward, simple design to be found under your nose. Henri Cartier-Bresson and his definition of the decisive moment, where all the elements came together at one moment. If your camera was there at the right moment, you could take this picture of a man jumping over a puddle, mimicked by the circus poster of jumpers in the background. Or children playing in the ruins in Madrid. Those sort of things were typical of this era too.